Welcome to Ohio VolleyTalk. Alongside me here, Snowson, I'm Elliot Skelly. Joining us today is the play-by-play broadcaster from Miami Hockey. Been doing that for about 17 years, and more importantly for our show, he's also worked for ESP Media for about 10 years, which broadcasts different high school sports, including boys volleyball. I'd like to introduce Greg Waddell. How you doing, Greg?
Guys, good to be here with you. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, happy to have you. So I guess the first question is, since you've been broadcasting for so long, how has the level of play shifted over the years?
It really has been a lot of fun to watch the progress of the sport and how much it has grown. I think it went. I was lucky enough to join ESP Media with the volleyball back in 2014, and I think at that point it was a pretty well established sport, but I think at that point it was still very fringe, and it was a spring sport, and there wasn't a whole lot of early development through the middle schools or through the younger grades getting into high school. So I think as the years have progressed, you've seen a lot of these athletes now that have become, I don't want to say strictly volleyball players, but they have played a lot more elite level volleyball, club volleyball, like you'll see in soccer or like you'll see in baseball. So I think it's made it a little bit more of a specialized sport for these young athletes. And the level of play has just gotten so much better. It really has been a lot of fun to watch the progress.
Absolutely. And you talked about 2014. I'm not mistaken, but I believe that was the first year ESP ended up broadcasting the state final for when it was OHS BVA. I think
Correct. Yeah. So we kind of, they had done 1 year without me, but I don't think it was kind of at the level of broadcast. I think it was more video stream and an occasional comment, but it was very in the infancy, I think, of the technology level of I don't want to say podcasting, but more so the streaming broadcasting. So it was kind of there was a year or so where they just had the video streams, and then when we got to 2014, we were at Hamilton High School, and we really went for it. And that was the first year I had joined with ESP Media with Rob Ebel, and he really, I think, had a vision for what he wanted to do, and the OHS BVA was all behind him as well. It was all about growing the sport at that point. And so that was the first year that we really kind of made it a broadcast type of a scenario. And then from there, we moved up to Columbus and started doing it at Capital University. And it really took off from there. And it really was, part of that, I think, the growth of the sport. Not only were the guys on the court kind of becoming in their own and becoming volleyball players, not just other athletes playing volleyball in the spring to do something. They were really volleyball players. And that was the same thing. We were kind of following their trajectory on the broadcast as well.
Got it. So going back to your time in general calling volleyball, do you have any interesting experiences from your volleyball broadcasting career?
Yeah, I mean, we were a lot of guys that were not overly familiar with volleyball in general, because at that point for us, we had done a lot of broadcasting of football, of basketball, and kind of the more traditional sports that you'll see at the high school level. So we were branching out just a little bit, getting into the volleyball and trying to do some baseball broadcast, and a lot of it had to do with the equipment that we had. You needed to have good type of equipment, and that's one thing that Rob Ebel never shied away from. He wanted to make sure he had the best type of equipment that he could to give the best possible broadcast that we could on a limited platform. And so I think as we kind of grew, the sport was growing with us. We were trying to keep up with the technology aspect of it all. So those first few years that I remember as we went from Hamilton High School then up to Capital, we wanted to kind of try to grow with it as well, and not just have one camera shooting all the time, right at the floor. We wanted to make it something that was not only enjoyable for the players, for their family, but we wanted outside people. We wanted, fans of the schools, the students themselves. If they couldn't be at the games, we wanted them to watch along and feel like they were a part of the broadcast, to feel like they were part of the actual event themselves.
Yeah, I think you accomplished that goal for sure. The broadcasts are really high quality. So you said you weren't really familiar with volleyball before broadcasting. How did you guys end up learning the sport?
So we had, like you do pretty much any sport, you like to have somebody that does color with you that is maybe a former player or a former coach or something along those lines. We had a guy named Bill Eckhoff who in Cincinnati was, and we were headquartered out of Cincinnati. So for our broadcast, we tried to do it statewide, but because we were from Cincinnati, I think we tended to be around the Cincinnati schools a little bit more. And Bill Eckhoff had been a longtime coach. His son had played in boys volleyball at Moeller High School. And then he had also become a coach in club in the summer. Bill Eckhoff had. And then he was also working in girls volleyball at Mount Notre Dame High School as a coach, and then was also coaching at Archbishop Moeller High School as well. So I think our broadcast kind of went with him. He would kind of guide us on what we needed to do, what we needed to focus on, and learning the positions, learning plays. And I mean, it was so much more than, 1, 2, 3 over. I mean, there were the strategies that I was not familiar with as ever having played more than rec league or gym volleyball, like a lot of people had. It was a learning experience for me on the job, but the athleticism of so many of the guys made it so enticing for me to want to learn more. And so I really became enthralled and really enjoyed watching the athleticism of all these athletes that were out there and trying to do the very best they could at the highest level they could, while they were still growing. The sport at that time was still, considered a club sport or whatever at the high school level. So it wasn't a sanctioned sport or OHSAA sport, but it was a lot of fun to watch that whole development and for me to learn as we went along.
Mm-hmm. And I know from my experience too, when I started calling games for ESPX for the Volley Bombers, I kind of had to pick up the game. I give a lot of credit to my color guy, Anthony France. He really taught me a lot about the game and just talking to the players and just try to get the mechanisms down, because I didn't know much about volleyball, and yet here I am and I learned so much about it.
Yeah. And we're supposed to be those guys that are the experts. So,
Yeah.
but here we are kind of learning on the job. But I mean, I think a lot for me, I just let the action kind of take center stage. And, the one thing I wanted to do was try to highlight the names of the players and make sure that, the players got the recognition that they deserved. The play itself, it could kind of stand alone, and that stuff would kind of take care of itself. I wanted to make sure I got the right name of who made that great play. And to me, that was the most important part. So as we went along, you could start to learn, some of the terms that were going on. And Coach Eckhoff certainly helped me.
So you called what was formerly the West Regional Finals and then also the state finals. So the West Regional Finals was just you by yourself, play-by-play and analysis. And then in the state finals or the state tournament, you had a guy doing play-by-play and you were typically the analyst. I know a seasoned pro like you can make it easy, but talking about just volleyball for like 6 hours in a day is pretty tough. Filling the dead air. How does the mindset change from going solo to having 2 people?
So, I mean, I think it goes back to just having done so many different sports over the years. If you've ever broadcast a baseball game, you realize there is a lot of downtime in baseball. So you've got to have a lot of extra preparation that goes in with that. You need to have as much, fill information as you can to kind of highlight those dead times. So when I'm by myself, it's kind of the same thing. And I learned to do it in hockey as well. Hockey is a lot faster paced sport and there's not as much downtime. So when I have a color guy with me or an analyst with me, I want to make sure I involve them in the broadcast. And those first actually couple of years, if we go back and look at some of those broadcasts, Bill kind of took the lead. And I wouldn't say he was exactly play-by-play, but he would call the action, and I was more the guy that kind of did the broadcasting in and out of the breaks or would reset the score. And so I was kind of more the technical guy, and Bill kind of did that play-by-play. And that was where I kind of learned a lot about the game, was listening to him do some of that stuff. And then, when you're by yourself, and you mentioned a couple of those broadcasts and even a little bit more behind the scenes, I was running everything. I was running I had a camera guy that was helping me out, but I was running the video switcher and the score. And so you go back and look, and there might be a time where the score is about 4 or 5 points behind because I was trying to do a little bit of everything. And as you guys will know, and especially when you're doing the streaming kind of things as opposed to bigger size broadcast, sometimes you are a one-man show, and you have to learn to kind of do all of it. And so having the prep time going in there was the most important part. And if I could ever tell a broadcaster, you can never have too much information. You might not get to use all of it, and sometimes some of your best stuff will stay in the notebook and you never even get to mention it. But the more you have, the better that you will be. You'll be able to fill some of that downtime or lengthy time if you're on the air for a long time. And another thing, if you guys ever get a chance to do this as well, I was fortunate enough. I worked for a while with in Cincinnati at WLW, and then it was 1530 ESPN 1530. Back then, it was known as the Sports Animal. I got to do talk shows and do sports talk. So you learn to communicate. You learn to have conversations, and to me, that's the most important part. Is you're almost trying to have a conversation with your viewer, with your listener, and make sure that they feel a part of it. And so you want to be conversational with them. And doing talk shows and sports talk, and at times where you might not get phone calls, so you're killing 10 minutes at a time. You're talking to yourself, it feels like, but you have to be conversational to make it seem interesting. But somewhere down the road, it might help you a lot more than you would have ever imagined, and you'll get that recall and think, oh wow, man, I'm glad I was getting to do the switcher that one time, the video switcher, and trying to broadcast at the same time. It helps you to be able to do more than one thing.
Back towards volleyball, you talked about a lot of the different sports that you've covered: baseball, hockey. I know you and I did a basketball game together last year. When you look at how volleyball is and just how you call the game, how does it differ from all of those other sports?
I think it's such a fast-paced game in small spurts. So, I mean, you might have set, then 1, 2, 3, spike, and the play's over. I mean, it's a really quick, explosive play. So knowing who is on the floor, knowing who is receiving the ball or passing the ball, whatever the case is, that to me was the most important part. Maybe not saying everything that was happening, especially if it's a video broadcast. You don't necessarily have to say every player that touches the ball. You can always go back and just reset the play after it happened. Sometimes you don't want to get yourself into trouble by getting behind the play, by trying to remember names, and you're like, I'm a second behind the first player, and then the next 2 other players have already touched the ball at that point.
You reference information. How much do you get from coaches, like stats or schedules or anything like that?
I mean, I've done the state championship every year from 2014 through this past season, and I think with the OHSAA taking over now, I think that probably that run's come to an end. I haven't heard exactly what's going to happen coming up later on this spring into the end of the season. But as we were the OHSBVA, the coaches took such a definitive role in the administrative aspects of growing the game that they were very, very good to myself. I would reach out to him. Coach Eckhoff, who was doing the broadcasts with me, he knew a lot of these guys, so could reach out to them. And maybe, sometimes they would give us stats. Sometimes they have internal stats that they would pass along. Sometimes there were some stats that were online that you could find that would certainly help an awful lot. But the coaches, I got to give all the thanks to the coaches. I think, in the Cincinnati area, Sean Tierney over at Elder and Bill Ferris at St. Xavier, they've both been there the whole time that I've been doing the broadcast themselves. I think up in the Dayton area, Carol Bysack, she is still the longtime coach at Beaver Creek. She was just wonderful about providing me information. And it wasn't just stats. Sometimes it was what their future college plans were going to be, that maybe a lot of these kids weren't going to go on and play college volleyball, but maybe they had a 4.0 grade point average and we're going to go and be an electric, some kind of an engineer or something, or looking to go into pre-med. They knew that we were starving, and to help make our broadcast better, they would feed us as much information as they possibly could. So full credit goes to those coaches and to the administrators for being just the folks that provided us with all the information that we possibly could have.
So specifically from last year's playoffs, did you have a favorite match? I know some great ones were Liberty Moeller, Elder Moeller State Championship, and Baden Carroll was a D2 State Championship. Did you have a favorite?
Yeah, when I look back, one here you may have called it. Was it the Moeller St. X
Regional final, yeah.
Yeah, and I think they played out at Princeton. I went back and watched it, and watching the game, I was like, that is an amazing thing. You mentioned it as well, the Baden and Carroll match as well. That was kind of an exciting one. I know the Baden coach, her son was probably one of the better players on the team. Her name was Anitra Brockman.
Yeah.
And she was going to be, she had already announced that she was going to be leaving to go coach at college level. So it was, I think, it was a fun moment for her getting to coach her son and to know that they were going to have a chance to play for a state championship and eventually win it. Thinking back though, I'd love the matches where you think that it's going to be done. You think maybe it's going to be a 3-set, whitewash, and then all of a sudden somebody comes back and wins that 3rd set and then wins the 4th set. Now all of a sudden you're going to a 5th and final set. And if you can go 5 sets in a match, to me, that's so exciting because anything can happen at that point.
So I know you touched on it, but ESP Media will definitely be covering these playoffs, and then the future is uncertain right now.
Yeah, I know we had talked to because the OHSAA has their own contracts and their own ways of doing things. So, I'm not exactly 100% sure what the plan is going forward. I know there's the conversations are still taking place, but I hope, that we get a chance to be involved with it. I'd love to be a part of it moving forward. It's a great sport, and I'm glad it's finally getting the recognition as a sanctioned sport that it deserves, because I really truly feel like ESP Media and our broadcasting of the games of the week that we did for all those years was part of this whole growing process of the sport.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you to you and ESP Media for all you did for the sport. Definitely helped a lot in the growth. And thanks for coming on. I think that's all we got for you, but yeah, it's really good. Really good to get the perspective of someone who has seen volleyball from kind of an eagle eye perspective for all these years.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, guys. I appreciate it and wish you guys all the best of luck what you're doing. And maybe it'll be you guys calling the OHSA or the championships for both volleyball. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, it'd be sweet.
Yeah, who knows?
I'd love to see it.
Right,
thanks, guys.
All right, that was Greg Waddell. Thanks to him for coming on again. But we got a pretty good slate of matches coming up this week. So some big news that has happened recently. Last Friday, Beaver Creek took Darby in 4. And that was actually one of the only days I've ever seen. It only had 2 match days listed on Max Preps. Only Beaver Creek and Darby, and then another team were playing. So Darby, I think, despite the loss to Beaver Creek, they're still doing well. They took care of Thomas Worthington and Worthington Kilbourne, both in 3. So they're doing well in their league. Only behind Jerome, and they're tied with Berlin right now for the OC Cardinal standing. So it's still anyone's game over there. I think that says some stuff about Beaver Creek. Who weren't really sure how legit they were, but now, I believe they're a 1-loss team, only lost to Dakota East in 4, and Saturday morning games. So how much does that factor in? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it last week on whether or not Beaver Creek should be in the top 10. And I have to agree with you now. I mean, I think especially from what we've seen, especially last Friday against Darby, you're winning in 4. And I think the other thing to note is the fact that they're taking care of business at home. And once again, this is another big victory at Beaver Creek High School. They beat Elder in 3. Again, Saturday morning game, you can make of it as you wish, but nonetheless, a big victory once again for the Beavers.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking past that, one of the really big things to happen was Hudson at the Mount Vernon quad. They swept Centerville, Olentangy Berlin, and Mount Vernon. And I don't know. I was looking at it, and I was like, I don't know how high I'm going to put Hudson. And then I saw it beat Mount Vernon 25-13. 25-13. Mount Vernon's a really good team. I think both of us have had them in the top 5 the whole time. I think they're a very solid team, and Hudson really beat them pretty soundly. So to me, that has Hudson up very high. I put him at number 2 this week. We'll get into that more later on. But if you take a look at their schedule the rest of the year, it's basically like 11 free wins, honestly. I don't know. I kind of wish that they would schedule a little more competitively outside of their region. I know Liberty is kind of in the same deal, but they were forced into it with the league, and they did stuff like the Berlin quad. Obviously, you can't choose to go to the Centerville Elite 8, you get invited, but they played very competitive out of conference schedule. So I wish that Hudson did more of that, but it's still impressive. And I think as long as they keep winning crisply and they're not going 5 with any of the teams that are left, I think they're probably the solid number 2 spot. There's a good chance that both St. X and Hudson go undefeated.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think the one thing I wish is they would schedule a little bit more competitive, because I think when I look at the teams that are at the top of the Northeast, you have Ignatius, you have Firestone. Of course, for the past few years, it's been St. Edwards, although they haven't lived up to that billing this year. Firestone has also been in the running this year as they were last year. I think it's still in the case that Hudson is still in that range where if the state championship, or rather the state semifinals, were to begin today, I would have them representing the Northeast, because it feels like although they haven't had the most competitive of schedules, they've gotten the work done. Of course, they looked very solid against Ignatius, and then you beat a Mount Vernon team on their home court by that amount. You don't drop an entire set, the entire quad too, and that too, a quad featuring Centerville, Berlin, along with the Yellow Jackets of Mount Vernon. That's definitely a billing where you have Hudson now as your regional favorites.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, if my goal is to win a regional championship, Hudson's schedule is great. They play everyone in the North that could possibly compete with them. But, if you want to take that next step and be competitive for a state championship, I'd probably like to see a little more out of region competition. So it was good they went to the Mount Vernon quad. They did very well. I just wish they did a little bit more of that. Mount Vernon went 5 with Berlin, beat them in 5. So I think that keeps Mount Vernon in my top 5 at least. Now, the big story, I guess, besides Hudson is Sycamore. Just last night, last night from Thursday, Sycamore went 5 with Moeller. Did you catch that match? Did you have any thoughts on that match?
Yeah, I did. And I think the one thing that I think people outside of the GCL don't realize is how big of a result this is for Sycamore right now, and how big of a result this was had they pulled it off. Again, as I saw watching that one, set 2, the Aves were at set point up 24-22, and props to Moeller rallying and winning that set 27-25. The Aves took set 1 and set 3, so had the
Could have
Aves
been a
gotten
sweep.
yep, exactly. And I look at the one game that I compare Sycamore Moeller to is Walnut Hills St. X last year. To put in perspective, St. X had not lost to a non-GCL team from the state of Ohio on their home court in a while, more than 10 years, from like 2022. So when Walnut Hills won that game, that was absolutely historic. And again, the OHS BVA kind of credited Walnut Hills, giving them the higher seed over St. X once it was done. Sycamore, again, I said it last week, they had to go to Moore, get a competitive result. I think this is more than competitive. I think when I look at this, I'm not necessarily sure if they get a 3 seed over a team like Elder, especially in the Southwest once we get to the playoffs. But
I
I
don't know.
think that,
I think that might happen at this point. You look at
you know,
Elder's
I
6-loss
wouldn't be
team.
surprised.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised knowing that Sycamore's playing St. X, at least for the Bombers. That will be their final game of the regular season. But I think at the rate we're going, Sycamore is definitely hosting a playoff game, and they have a lot to be proud of.
Yeah, and Sycamore has the head-to-head win over Elder too, so I bet that'll factor into it. But I think the big thing for me was I was just really surprised with this Sycamore team. I mentioned like in an earlier episode that I saw them at the Wittenberg tournament that was over the summer, and it was basically Owen Walsh, the big middle, very good, he put the ball down, and then everyone else was just trying to get the ball to Owen Walsh. It was really just him, and it was enough to beat some teams, but you run a one-dimensional offense like that, it wasn't enough to beat balanced teams. But apparently there's a lot of improvement because they had several guys that were bouncing balls on Moeller. And I mean, bouncing balls, not just getting kills. Now, I think the big thing was, it's a good thing I'm not an athletic trainer, because Haggard's injury clearly wasn't a one-day injury because he was out. So Moeller was down and outside. And I guess I'm not too familiar with their bench. I think I know their starters pretty well. I'm not too familiar with their bench. I guess Lee Meyer did not feel that he had a solid enough OH3 that he wanted to put them in there, because he ended up moving Patterson to the pin, who is not as dominant as I would expect someone who's 6'10" to be on the pin. And then they had their 2 middle hitters going, and it just, they were off the whole night, it looked like. Not a lot of offensive production. Even like passing was just not as good as I'm used to seeing from a Moeller team. But yeah, credit to Sycamore. I thought they did a really great job, a really good statement moral victory. I don't really love to say that word, but I think that was as close to a moral victory as you can get. Speaking of Beaver Creek again, St. X went 5 with Beaver Creek. They are now one of just 2 teams to take X5. It's Darby in the Centerville Elite 8 tournament, and now Beaver Creek. It was almost messed up the undefeated streak. St. X is now at 14-0, which ties Liberty's run from last year. Liberty actually had 14 sweeps through the quarterfinals of the Centerville Elite Eight. Now, part of that was some inferior league competition, but still, 14-0 is 14-0. So X is at 14-0 now. I think the only teams that have a shot at snapping their undefeated streak are probably Moeller and now Sycamore, I think, are the only ones who have a shot at stopping that. Any thoughts on St. X?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it seems like this team, of course, and I've talked about this before, they have their struggles. They sometimes have their lapses, but I think in general, it also shows how good this Beaver Creek side is, taking St. X to 5. And we've seen the Bombers once again get a victory in 5. They beat Darby in 5 in the Centerville Elite Tournament. But I think, especially going into that game against Moeller, again, similar to the Crusaders, they struggled a little bit in the case that they couldn't get the easy win. So I think there is a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. Again, going to Moeller, always been a tough place for the Bombers to play, but it seems like they have much more talent going forward. Sycamore is it's an interesting battle for me in the sense that for the Bombers, it's senior night, but
last match of the season too.
Exactly.
That'd be something. Snap their undefeated streak, last match of the season.
Exactly. But I think it also goes to the fact of that Walnut Hills St. X game. I got a little inside note from the players that they did not practice at all that weekend. Keep in mind, 3 days before they beat the Elder side that had Joey Bianco, Drew Mounty, Will Buskin. So they essentially had a few days off, and it kind of showed there in the Walnut Hills game. On the other side of things, this is a team that's facing Walnut Hills, I think, a couple of days before they face Sycamore for that final match of the season. So it will be interesting to see what Coach Ferris does in terms of time management once we get to that game against the Aves. But I think that game against Moeller, you and I both circled it in the fact that if there's a chance the shoe drops in the regular season, it's happening on Friday. It will be interesting to see if Moeller lives up to the billing and pulls the upset.
So just to clarify, you're talking about last year's matchup with Walnut Hills that St. X dropped in 5, right?
Yeah, they actually dropped it in 4, but yeah, last year's matchup.
Right.
This year, they're facing them, I believe, on like May 2nd or something, like a couple days before they host Sycamore.
Roger Bacon lost in 4 to Milford. I guess that's kind of a competitive loss. It wasn't what I was expecting them to take. I don't know. I still have them high in my D2 rankings. I'm not sure. I know you had them a little bit lower. Baden lost to Fenwick in, I believe, 4 tonight. So that was pretty big. It just shakes up the D2 ranks just a little bit. I think there's only realistically like 5 or 6 teams that are competing for a state championship. It's just tough with, I don't know. I think there's under 30 teams. So it's tough to flesh out, a really competitive top 10 that's going for a state title. But there's definitely some good competition there. Definitely some evenly balanced teams. Turn over to look at our D1 rankings here. A little bit different this week. We're no longer locking step on the top 4. Both have St. X at number 1, kind of an obvious one. I brought Hudson up to number 2. I think they're now either 11-0 or 12-0, something like that. But again, it doesn't really matter. I think they don't have a ton of challenging matches to close out their season. It would be nice if they played Ignatius again when Ignatius was healthy. But I don't think we're going to get that until maybe a regional final. Liberty, I have them at 3. You have them at 2. That's solid. I've got Moeller at 4. You have Moeller at 3. And yeah, I think that's all good. I said I was going to keep Mount Vernon in my top 5. I actually put Beaver Creek at 5, Mount Vernon at 6. I think Beaver Creek has a really big chance. I believe it's tomorrow Saturday at the Mount Vernon quad. That's with Beaver Creek, Mount Vernon, St. Ignatius, and Olentangy. So they have a shot to continue to prove that they belong in the top 5 and over Mount Vernon.
Yeah, I think the one thing for me with Mount Vernon is the fact that Hudson's a pretty good squad overall. I'm not going to ding them that much. And you beat a solid Berlin side in 5. I think it's also deserving of it. I think the one team that really jumped in my rankings, and you can see it here, Sycamore at number 6. You go into Moeller, you almost beat them. You almost sweep them, I might add. You definitely deserve to be in that spot overall. Again, I think the one thing is who's going to move up the rankings per se, and who's going to have that chance. I think one game that really decided my rankings overall was Beaver Creek beating Darby in 4. As you can see, Darby's not in my rankings. And then Ignatius picking up a 5-set win over Stowe Monroe on Thursday. That also kind of influenced my rankings, kept the Wildcats in, but at the same time, there's just so many teams that are on the outside looking in. When you look at teams like Darby, Elder, again, Elder was in my top 10 to your dismay as you kind of fought it, but nonetheless, a lot of great
I would say
teams.
rightfully so. In
Yeah,
fairness,
well,
but
yeah, that's true. But at the same time, it just seems like there's so many great teams out there. And even though I have this top 10 right now, this could easily change in a week. This is a work in progress from now until the end of the regular season.
yeah, absolutely. I think I took a lot from Beaver Creek's win over Darby, and even just going 5 with Say Next, I think is really impressive with how dominant they've been. So that prompted me to put them at number 5. I totally agree about Sycamore. I had them at 7. I would say for me, I would count Ignatius's win in 5 over Stowe more against them than I would for them. Stowe's solid, but it's probably not a team that you should be going 5 with if you're in the top 10. Now, I know Ignatius is just now getting healthy. I think Don told me they just got their setter back. So I think they're at full strength now. But they missed out on a lot of time to get reps with each other and get development. So I hope they can rebound Saturday at the quad. I'd like to see them be full strength because I think they have, the team to make a deep run in state. So hopefully that works out and they can get back to the form they were in earlier in the season. Looking at D2 now, pretty similar stuff. DeSales, St. Mary, no change at 1 and 2. The Fenwick upset over Baden obviously prompted us both to put Fenwick over Baden. I still have Roger Bacon at 4. You've got them at 7. That's really the only significant difference. I don't know. Any rationale behind that so far?
I mean, I think it just comes to the fact of their losses. Again, I may have put it prematurely last week, but I think after the results we've seen, again, facing a Lakota East side that hasn't gotten too many losses, I believe just to McNick and to Sycamore.
Correct.
It definitely kind of hurts Roger Bacon in that regards when you're going to a Milford side who isn't the best team in the ECC, still solid, but nonetheless, in a matchup like that, it feels like you've got to be at the very least, a little more competitive, get it to 5 and maybe pull out a win over there.
Yeah, I'd say that was probably, I might put him at 5. If I could do it over again, I might have put him at 5. That was probably the only thing I wasn't super sure on. But yeah, again, I mean, the D2 side is kind of built to be chalk. I think really maybe you include Carroll, but outside of that, it's like the top 5 teams and up that are really competing for a state championship. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see come playoff time. Again, almost certainly DeSales comes out of the East. The only other team in the East that's in our top 10 is St. Charles. So yeah, we'll see what happens out of there. So a new segment we're going to be introducing this week it was introduced to me by a faithful viewer, shall remain nameless, also a potential future guest for the season. But match of the week. Overall, we're going to do 2 match of the weeks. Actual match of the week and unranked match of the week to help spotlight some less successful teams or less obviously successful teams. So first up, main match of the week. I know it's got to be pretty obvious. Who is it?
St. X versus Moeller.
Yep. Tomorrow, Friday night, probably the day this releases, it is tonight. Moeller's got a chance to snap X's undefeated streak and probably secure a share in the GCL if they win. And X, I think, actually, do they secure a share if they win tonight? If they win Friday?
I think
they do because Elder's 2 loss, right? Yeah, and they only play LaSalle after who's 3 loss. So yeah, I think that would secure them a share of the GCL South. That'd be pretty big. They could be the first team in a while to go 6-0 and win it.
Yeah, that's very true and quite likely as well. I mean, I haven't done research on this, but when you look back at the teams in the GCL, especially those who made a run, of course, even Elder last year, they were quite dominant, but they did have that loss on the road to St. X. And even when I believe this was true, even when the Bombers won it in 2019, they actually ended up losing a game to Moeller in GCL play. Don't quote me on it, but I believe that might be true.
Yeah, it's a tough league. It's tough to go undefeated in any league. It is especially tough in the GCL South. Just a lot of tough teams. So even just winning it outright is a really big honor. So yeah, really interested to see how that happens. What is your set score prediction?
You know what? It's going to be a close one. Moore's going to keep this competitive, but I think the Bombers definitely have the chance, and they definitely have the power in this game. Give me them to win in 4.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would assume Haggerty stays out, which is just still such a big loss for Mueller. Missing him not only outside hitting and blocking, but also in serve receive and passing. So I'm interested to see what lineup they run, if they keep Patterson at the pin, or if they, I don't know, maybe you move Gesselbrock and throw him to the outside and try someone else on the right side. I'm not sure exactly what they'll do. All I know is clearly the lineup at Sycamore did not go too well. But I got X in 3. I think X is going to take advantage of the injuries I think they've got over at Moore, and yeah, be right on their way to winning a GCL title. For our unranked match of the week, we've got Lakota East versus Lakota West. Now, these are two solid teams that just have been not quite in the top 10 this year. Lakota East, obviously, Beaver Creek's sole loss. So they're definitely a team worth looking at. Now, who do you have winning this one?
I think it should be another close game. Again, this one close to my heart as well. Before I was in St. X, I was at Lakota Local School District. I was on the east side of things over there, so I've got my biases, but there is no bias over here. Again, two interesting teams that have tried to battle for the GMC. Granted, Sycamore has been in the driver's seat in that regards, but nonetheless, two good solid sides. I liked what I saw out of Lakota East today against Roger Bacon. I think it continues against the Firebirds on Tuesday. Give me the Thunderhawks to win in 4.
Yep, completely agree. Lakota East in 4. I think Lakota East is the better team, and they've demonstrated that. They've got some guys who can put a ball down. But I think the rivalry will get to them, and they'll drop one. Lakota East versus Lakota West, man, does not get much closer, even in name, than that. So, all right, well, I guess that'll do it for this week. Mihir, any final thoughts?
Not really, but just going back to the rankings, it's going to be really interesting what happens this week. Again, a few people, especially in D2, taking this week off because of Easter week. It will be interesting to see how they respond next week with some interesting games coming up.
Absolutely. From Ohio VolleyTalk, this has been Mihir and I. We will catch you next week.